After a day that seemed to stretch endlessly, I found myself buried in stress that clung to me like a shadow. Meetings dragged on, deadlines pressed down on my shoulders, and every word from my boss sounded like another blow to my already fraying patience. All I wanted was to step into a space where I could breathe, where someone would notice how heavy everything felt. But at home, it was different. My partner, once attentive and full of warmth, had become increasingly detached. Their responses to my exhaustion were short, often careless. "You'll be fine, just get some rest," was all I heard, no hand on my shoulder, no genuine concern. It was like talking to a wall that no longer echoed my words back. The distance between us was no longer subtle, it had grown into a silence that followed me into every corner of the house. At work, however, there was one person who noticed what others didn't, my assistant. They were efficient, reliable, but more than that, they had a way of catching the small details I thought no one saw. If I skipped lunch, they'd quietly place a snack on my desk. If the tension in my voice gave away too much, they'd slow down and ask if I needed help with anything. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet, but it was something I found myself leaning on without realizing. Where my partner had grown indifferent, this presence filled the void with simple, thoughtful gestures. That evening, when I finally closed my laptop, my assistant lingered a little longer than usual, offering to wrap up loose ends so I could leave early. It was a small act, but it struck me deeply. For the first time all day, I felt like someone genuinely cared about easing my burden, and that quiet kindness stayed with me long after I left the office. The next day carried the same weight, but heavier. A presentation I had poured myself into was dismissed in minutes, leaving me humiliated in front of colleagues. By the time I left the conference room, my chest felt tight, as though I had been holding my breath for hours. I wanted to go home and release it all, to feel comfort in the arms of someone who was supposed to be my anchor. But when I walked through the door and tried to explain, the response was predictably hollow. A quick glance up from a phone, a muttered, "You worry too much, it's not the end of the world," and then silence. That silence carved into me more deeply than the criticism I'd received at work. I was invisible in my own home, and the loneliness of that realization stung in a way words couldn't capture. The contrast with my assistant was jarring. Without me saying a word, they noticed I was off balance. Instead of offering clichés, they acted. They stayed behind after others left, helping me polish the work that had been so quickly dismissed. When I reached for my bag, ready to drag my tired body home, they slid a cup of tea toward me and said gently, "You've done more than enough today." It was such a simple thing, but it broke something open in me. The thoughtfulness felt undeserved, yet I clung to it because no one else seemed to notice when I was falling apart. It wasn't just the tea, or the extra effort, they were showing me what it felt like to be seen, truly seen, in the small, quiet ways that mattered. As I drove home later that night, their kindness played over in my mind, and I realized I was beginning to crave that feeling more than I should. It was late one evening when the weight of everything finally caught up with me. The office had emptied hours before, leaving only the sound of keyboards and the faint hum of the air conditioning. I sat there staring at a report I couldn't bring myself to finish, feeling the familiar ache of exhaustion and frustration pressing in. My assistant quietly appeared at my side, not with words of pity, but with the same steady presence I had come to rely on. They didn't rush me or push me to keep going. Instead, they asked if I was all right, their voice soft in a way that made me pause. No one had asked me that in weeks, not genuinely. I found myself answering honestly, speaking of the pressure, the loneliness, and how much it hurt to go home to someone who no longer noticed. The words poured out before I could stop them, the dam finally breaking. They listened, really listened, their eyes never leaving mine. In that moment, I felt a connection so sharp it almost frightened me. It was supposed to be a professional relationship, nothing more, but the line blurred when they reached across the desk and rested their hand lightly on mine. It wasn't dramatic or forceful, just a quiet acknowledgement that they understood, that I wasn't alone. That small touch ignited something I hadn't felt in years, a warmth that spread through me, uninvited yet undeniable. For a split second, I forgot about boundaries, about vows, about the life waiting for me outside that office. All I could feel was the closeness of someone who cared enough to reach me in my most vulnerable state. As I pulled my hand back, guilt flickered, but it was tangled with an intoxicating sense of being alive again, and I couldn't silence it. The days that followed were different, though nothing outwardly changed. I carried the memory of that moment with me, the way their hand had rested on mine, the way I had felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. It was such a small gesture, but it echoed louder than anything else in my life. At home, the distance with my partner grew more obvious, though I tried to carry on as if nothing was different. They remained distracted, indifferent, and when I hinted at my struggles, they brushed it off like an inconvenience. Normally, I would have forced myself to bury the sting, but this time it felt almost irrelevant, because I already knew where my comfort came from, and it wasn't them. The guilt came in quiet waves, usually late at night when I lay awake replaying everything. I told myself it was just kindness, that no lines had been crossed, but deep down I knew better. Emotional lines can be sharper than physical ones, and I had stepped past one without hesitation. I hadn't kissed them, hadn't confessed anything out loud, but the feelings growing inside